Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to Module 5, Person-Centered Theory. So we are making our way through. We are now to our third different helping approach that we're going to cover in our class after spending a couple of weeks talking about Freud's psychoanalytic theory and then last 2 weeks, Viktor Frankl's existential theory. And this conversation for the next 2 weeks, Carl Rogers' person-centered theory, is really just an extension of our conversation on existential theory. Because in many, many ways, what person-centered theory is just really an outgrowth of existential theory. So just like we've done with the first two theories, we're going to spend this first module, module number 5, talking about some core beliefs of this theory, and then module number 6 will be a conversation and some lecture notes and some application of how we take the ideas of the core ideas of this theory and apply them in helping professions. I know I've said this many, many times already in this class. This is especially true this week. We could say so much about Carl Rogers in person-centered theory. Easily, we could build an entire course, an entire semester of just talking about this important helping approach that many times when we're first introduced to it, we don't understand it and we sometimes even discount it. I remember being a graduate student many, many years ago. I didn't know who Carl Rogers was. I never heard of him till I was taking some counseling classes. And I remember my professor making a big deal in our theories class about Carl Rogers. I mean, he built it up and said, man, this is a, and we started talking about it. And I remember sitting there as a student thinking, this doesn't sound very helpful. What is this? What is this theory? I mean, this sounds almost too simple, too simplistic. What do you mean this is such a great helping approach? Well, I've learned over time through maturity and through just kind of working through the years and experience how vital this helping approach is to the field of psychology and counseling. Now, here's the thing I want to say to you before we get started, kind of like our last 2 weeks with existential theory. This is a theory that kind of proposes a few ideas that cuts against the grain of what we normally believe and what our world believes. And so as you come into this class, if you're like me, the world kind of rubs off on us and we kind of have the world's mindset, the world belief system. And then we come across a theory like existential theory or a theory like person-centered theory that kind of has some ideas that run counter to that. It might kind of rock our world a little bit, but that is a good thing. So person-centered theory is an example of what we call a humanistic approach to helping. I give you some information in your lecture notes about what that means. Existential theory, which this theory was built out of by Carl Rogers, is also an example of a humanistic approach. Kind of the history was that after Freud's theory, psychoanalytic theory, which we covered in modules 1 and 2, um, took hold for about 50 years or so in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. What we call humanism or humanistic psychology began to take hold. And Carl Rogers was developing this theory during that time. And Rogers, who was trained in Freudian psychotherapy, which is always fascinating to me, that Carl Rogers was really trained, like all men of his generation, men and women. He was trained in traditional Freudian psychotherapy. And once he got out into the field as a young man in his 40s and 50s, he began to think to himself, this is just not, this doesn't quite work and fit with what I believe as a person and who I am as a person and the clients that I work with. And humanistic psychology was really predominant during that time. And Rogers became a believer in existentialism and existential theory and humanistic psychology, and he developed this game changing counseling approach. If you've never heard the name Carl Rogers, he is often referred to as a second Freud sometimes. He is kind of seen as the second large figure in the field of counseling and psychology. Freud was kind of first, and then here comes Carl Rogers. Now those two men could not be more polar opposites. Rogers, I've got a video, I believe I got a video posted for you in your module this week, which shows you an interview with Carl Rogers. He passed away many, many years ago. Rogers was a very easygoing, quiet, grandfatherly, nurturing kind of person. Very low key, very humble, very philosophical kind of a guy. And he was known as an expert therapist. People would come from all around to work with him. And Rogers just had that unique skill and ability to sit and to be present and to listen to people and help them. And he did it with very, very little, if any at all, advice giving. He listened to people. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Listening, such a powerful, powerful tool that he promoted as being so important. So we could say so much about Carl Rogers. Again, developed this theory out of moving away from the psychoanalytic approaches, although there are some similarities in some ways, and in just so many ways seen as kind of a giant of the field of psychology in many ways. Let me give you some themes, real simple themes that are very humanistic. So again, it's important to kind of understand that again, this is not an analytic approach. Freud was more analytical. Existential theory and person-centered theory are humanistic. So here are some ideas that are ground, foundational, bedrock beliefs of humanism that Rogers believed in, and he developed this theory. Number one, here's this interesting idea that says that men and women are trustworthy. Now that's an interesting idea, and today a lot of people don't believe that. No, you can't trust anybody. Well, part of why we believe we can't trust people is because we've been let down by people. And so we know ourselves as not being trustworthy. So we think everybody's not trustworthy. Rogers, like most humanists, believed and said, well, usually being untrustworthy is based on experience oftentimes. And really, people can be trusted if you will trust them, if you will give people your trust. And even when people let you down, well, they don't let you down because they're not trustworthy. They let you down because they're human and we're all imperfect. And so this idea that people are trustworthy, this idea that people can, will, and do grow and change. We have a kind of a mentality today, unfortunately, in our world that people are who they are. And no one can grow and change. Humanistic psychology says we are growing every day and we are changing every day. You are not the same person you were yesterday, neither am I, and I won't be the same person tomorrow that I am today because we have experiences and we cannot not grow. We are growing, we are changing. That it sort of rejects that idea that I'm just staying right where I am. Humanistic psychology says you and I never stay right where we are. We're always moving. We just don't realize it. We're always growing. It's just a matter of how. It's a matter of what direction are we going. We're never standing still. Feels like we are, but we never are. Life is never standing still. It's always moving, including us. It's just a matter of where are we going. That's the issue. That's not are we moving, it's where are we moving. So Rogers was a believer that men and women could grow, are growing, will grow, can change, and so he believed about his clients the best of them. He was a very hopeful, positive kind of person. He didn't care who he worked with. He always tried to communicate, "Hey man, I'm for you. And you know what? I don't know where you are, but wherever you want to be and want to go, you can go in that direction because you can. You have the capacity to do that. I believe in you. I'm for you." A very positive, hopeful kind of person. The idea that we have the capacity to understand ourselves. Talked about that a little bit last couple of times with existential theory. That we have the capacity for self-awareness, and therefore we can understand ourselves, and so therefore we can learn from our mistakes and learn where we are and can make decisions about our lives. And that none of us should be stuck. We feel stuck, but we don't have to be stuck. We aren't victims of our situation and circumstances because we have control and capacity to do different things in our lives. And where we are in our lives is because of where we have put ourselves in our lives. That's not a negative thing. That's a powerful thing. It means that if I want to move, I can move and do something different, right? A little bit of some different ideas than we see out there in our world today. Those are some foundational humanistic ideas that this theory, this helping approach is kind of built on. And I want to talk to you about two things. And really, this theory used to be called client-centered therapy. Now it's called person-centered. But the word client is really, really important. And I want to visit with you about a couple of things that have to do with the client. Rogers was a believer in this idea that a helping approach ought to be built not on the helper, but on the client. That the client is the one who is coming for help. They should be the focus of our work. Despite their problems, despite their weaknesses, despite their mistakes, they are valuable and important. We ought to build our helping approach on them. And Rogers, because he was a humanist, had this radical idea that I review with you briefly in your lecture notes, and it's this, that the client is the expert of themselves, not the helper. The helper is not an expert. The helper is a helper. And just because I may have 5 or 6 degrees on my wall and have 2 different licenses does not make me an expert. It makes me trained and educated. But that doesn't mean that I know what you need to be doing. You know what you need to be doing. What do you want to do? Right? So, one of the ideas that came out of Freudian psychology, again, I don't know if Freud wanted this to happen, if this is intentional or unintentional, but one of the ideas that came out of Freudian psychotherapy is still around today. And it's this idea that as a client, if I'm a client, I'm messed up, I'm broken, I don't know what I'm doing. So, therapist, I'm paying you money, or the court is sending me to you. You got to figure me out and analyze me and fix me and help me figure out what I'm going to do in my life because I don't know what I'm doing. So, this idea that the client is broken and doesn't know what they're doing, the helper is an expert. So, the helper's job is to analyze and to problem solve and to say, well, what about this? Or what about this? Or what about this? That's the helper's role because the helper obviously knows what they're doing. Sarcastically, I'm saying, right? Obviously, look at all the degrees on my wall. Look at this nice office that I have. Obviously, I know what I'm doing. You don't know what you're doing, client. And we would never say that, but that was kind of the mentality, the dynamic, the culture in helping back in Freud's days. Here I am, an expert person, come pay me a bunch of money, I'll figure your situation out. Well, Rogers rejected that idea. And he said, nope. Just because someone is a helper, that's all they are. They're not an expert. The client is the expert because we are the experts of ourselves. If there's anything we should know well, it is ourselves. And if we don't know ourselves, we should and we can. So, therefore, the helper is not an expert. The helper is a fellow traveler. The helper is a supporter. The helper is a challenger. The helper is if you want to use the word a coach, the helper comes alongside the client not to tell them what to do, but to help the client figure out what they need to do. Because the idea is this, here's a key idea, which again, Freud kind of wrestled with. Rogers didn't wrestle with it. Rogers believed that regardless of who people were, you and I have the capacity to figure things out. All of us are competent enough, even though we make a bunch of mistakes, even though we don't always know the right thing to do or say, we have the ability to figure things out. The client is competent. Is a great phrase that we would use with person-centered theory. The belief that the client is competent. Hey, helper, don't be telling all your clients what to do. They don't need that. Let them figure it out. Not make them, but put them in a position where they don't rely on you and help you figure it out. I remember back in my early days of graduate counseling, I remember one of the first times I was ever videotaped doing kind of a little counseling session as a part of my graduate training. And I thought it went pretty well. And honestly, I thought it was okay. I was nervous, but I thought it went pretty good. And then that video was critiqued by one of my professors and some of my classmates. Now that was pretty nerve wracking. I thought it went pretty well. And a lot of my classmates were like, man, Glenn, that's pretty good. I like how, man, your style, whatever. It wasn't until my professor at the very end said, let me ask you this question. And I remember her asking me just straight up, do you believe that this client is competent? And I was like, well, yeah. She said, okay, I'm just asking because sometimes in some of the questions that you asked her, I don't know, you almost kind of gave the impression that you didn't think she could figure. It's almost like you thought that you needed to help her figure something out. Do you need to help her figure something out, or can she figure it out? And I said, well, no, she can figure it out. She said, okay. She said, just be careful about that. It was a great learning experience for me because then I began to be careful about that when I was working with clients. That, you know what? Do I really believe my client, they may have all kinds of issues and they may have mental health problems or addiction, but do I believe they are competent? I should, because they are. And Rogers was the first kind of theorist who came along and said, you know what? Clients don't need to be fixed, they need to be helped. And the helper's role is not to fix people, it is to help people. So the client is competent. The client is the expert of themselves, not the helper. Key idea, first key idea. And then off of that, let's talk about this. Here's the second big idea. Man, this is an important idea, and it's this. Rogers believed, this theory promotes, person-centered theory promotes, that the greatest tool we have at our disposal when we work with our clients is the relationship that we build with them. And I give you in your lecture notes the term quality therapeutic relationship, QTR, quality therapeutic relationship is a phrase that Rogers coined. It is connected to this theory. Quality therapeutic relationship. Um, Freud was a believer that the relationship was important, and some of the other theorists we'll talk about later in this class, they believe that the relationship between me and the person I'm working with is important. Rogers believed it is central. This theory is kind of responsible for teaching us as helpers that the way that we handle ourselves and respond and treat people is the foundation of helping, comes from this theory. A quality therapeutic relationship that is characterized by three different components. Now, let's talk about, before we talk about each of them individually, I'm going to give you some just real simple examples and definitions. Each one of these three are equally important. Not one is more important than the other. Rogers was a believer that each of these three are equally important, number one. Number two, these are things that we strive to communicate. Do we always hit the mark? Not always. But we should always be striving, seeking to, growing into, as helpers, communicating to our clients, to not just have it up here, but to communicate it in how we talk and how we treat people. So, this idea of striving for helping people. Last thing is this. This theory promotes, and Rogers teaches us that if you and I can demonstrate these three things, we are already helping people. People will get help. We don't have to have advanced degree. You could be a counselor intern, you could be a human services student with no training at all. But if you can be empathetic and real and open and accepting of people, people will talk to you and people will get the help. People will get help. They will feel helped and they will get help. And if you and I will just communicate and embody those three things. Number one is genuineness. Here is the first of these three. Genuineness just means being real. Rogers promotes this idea because, again, kind of out of the Freudian days, kind of the idea with the Freudian days. You may remember this from your lecture notes and from our lecture a couple weeks back. Back in the Freudian days, kind of the idea was the helper was kind of distant, a little standoffish, very professional, friendly, but ultra professional. Kind of more neutral in a way. Rogers came along and said, you know what? As helpers, we are real people. Aren't we real people? We are real people. And we ought to be real people. We ought not to be behind a mask. We ought not to act like we are smarter than we are. There ought to be a sense of humility as we help people. And just because we are in a position of helping doesn't mean that we are better than people. And so we should never treat our clients in a way to where they think or where we communicate to them that we feel like we've got it figured out and we're better than them. So the idea of being real and being genuine, the idea of that doesn't mean, of course, that we have to tell all of our clients all of our problems. It just means being a real, sincere person. It means the idea of, sometimes we use the word transparency. Transparency just is a fancy word that means what you see is what you get. What you see is what you get. So as a helper, if I am a genuine person, when my clients work with me, they see me. They see the real. They don't see a fake Glenn. They don't see a mask or an act. They see and sense that this guy I'm talking to, this is how he is when he goes home. This guy I'm talking to, this is how he is when he's eating lunch with his friends. This is like a real person. This is not some sort of fake actor or some expert, sitting here analyzing me. This is a real person. So genuineness is the first key component of a quality therapeutic relationship. The second is what we call unconditional positive regard. It's a fancy term that, again, kind of is connected to this theory. Unconditional positive regard, I just think about the word acceptance, openness, and respect. Those three words, acceptance, openness, and respect, are to me are characterize this idea of unconditional positive regard. Excuse me. And so this idea of communicating to my clients that I am open to who they are, that I am accepting them for who they are, and that I am respectful of them as people. I may not always be able to agree with their choices. They may have lifestyles that aren't the same as mine, but that doesn't mean that I have to judge them. This idea of openness and communicating openness and acceptance. Some of you have heard the term unconditional love, for example. Some of you of certain, maybe you're Christian or certain faith expressions, this idea of unconditional love, of accepting people for who they are despite their behavior and sort of being willing to go the extra mile with them. Well, we don't love our clients and helping necessarily, but we communicate unconditional positive regard, acceptance and openness and respect, communicating that in addition to, so you take genuineness and you add to that this idea that not only does my client perceive me as a real person, They also perceive me as an open person, as a respectful person, as an accepting person towards them, as a person who is not sitting in judgment of them or over them. You put those two things together, and man, that's powerful as helpers. If our clients can perceive us, their helpers, our clients can perceive us as real, genuine people and open, accepting, respectful people, that's pretty powerful. But then there's more. There's one more thing, and it is empathy, being empathetic, we would say. So, empathy you've heard of before. Empathy has all kinds of different definitions. Really, what empathy is, to me, empathy is connected to listening. You and I cannot be empathetic unless we are good listeners. Being empathetic is trying to understand the world of the client. It's trying to connect with the client in a way to where I understand how they're feeling, what they're thinking, and kind of what it's like kind of to be in their world. Maybe you've heard the phrase, it's like walking in there, putting myself in the client's shoes. It's a good definition of empathy. Trying to see the client's perspective from their perspective, putting myself on their level, not just thinking about me and my perspective, getting out of my perspective and getting into the client's perspective and being understanding and being empathetic, we would say. So again, this idea with empathy is if my clients can understand that I'm empathetic, well, then again, that communicates that I'm open to them, that I'm striving to understand, their situations. It's connecting with people oftentimes like on an emotional level is another thing we say, feeling the emotions of the client, sensing the emotions of the client. Some of you are in your basic counseling skills class, or you've been in basic counseling skills. And we talk sometimes in basic counseling skills about how listening is so important for all kinds of reasons. Number one, we listen to gather information because we want to make sure we have right information. But listening is deeper than that too. When you and I listen, we're not just listening for information. We're listening for experience. We're listening for emotion. We're listening for perspective. And it's one of the great ways we communicate empathy is by listening well to people and hearing what they're hearing what they're not saying, hearing, understanding even what people maybe not be communicating clearly to us is all about empathy, right? So empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness, these three components, again, they're separate components, but they're all interwoven with each other. Not one of them any more important than the other. They're all super important. They're all equally important. Kind of the idea with the quality therapeutic relationship is that if you and I can develop each of the three of these, we strive for that and we communicate them. Well, that's our greatest tool. Roger, this theory sort of teaches that, again, our skills, our knowledge, our background, all that's important. But what's most important is how we respond, who we are as people, how we respond, how we treat our clients. And maybe you've had this experience. I've had this experience. And working in the field of counseling and human services, I've known lots of people as professionals. I don't mean this in a bad way, but I've known lots of people as professionals who have advanced degrees. They've got 2 master's degrees. They went to prestigious universities. They've got 3 different licenses. They're an LCDC and an LPC and L whatever, right? They got all kinds of licenses, but they aren't effective helpers. Not always. Clients don't want to talk to them. Not always. Does that mean that someone knows how to help other people? Nope. That's because that's not really the base of our helping. This theory says that's not our education and our license, that's not the base of our helping. The base of our helping is who we are as people and how we treat people and the relationship that we build. It's our greatest tool is the relationship that we build with our clients. So 2 big ideas here. Who is the expert in the helping relationship? The client. Key idea number 2, our greatest helping tool is the relationship that we build with the client. We would say the quality therapeutic relationship characterized equally by empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness. Okay, so go look at your lecture notes this week. Do your discussion question, read the information in the textbook, good information as always in the textbook this week. Do your homework assignment. We're going to come back next week in module number 6. We're going to talk a little bit more, second week, about Rogers and person-centered theory. I will see you then.